What's up, my channel? It's your friendly neighborhood sassy blonde writer coming at you with some writing advice. Today we are going to be talking about more tips for underwriters. Now, there is a little backstory for what inspired me to come up with this video, so let me kind of get into that before we get into the meat and potatoes of this video. I recently had somebody who watched my first video on tips for underwriters to ask more specific advice on how to slow down and take their time when they write. First of all, I'm very flattered that people actually want to ask me for advice, and I had to think a lot about this question when it was asked to me. I didn't want to give advice about something that I don't even do as a writer or something that I struggle with and kind of talk out of turn in a sense, because I hate that. I hate when people give me advice about things that they themselves don't even do. That is one of my biggest pet peeves. So I really had to think carefully about my answer to this question. I think this is also a problem. You tend to have pretty low word counts when you're writing a book in general, then this is probably an issue you have as well. It's definitely correlation, not necessarily causation, but I find a lot of times that as an underwriter, my problem tends to be pacing. And I also found this when I got beta reading feedback as well. If overwriters have the problems with things moving too slow in their manuscripts, then underwriters have problems with things moving too fast. So this question was actually pretty perfect because, one, the person asking this question had already done some reflecting, which is great because they seem to have an understanding on why they were an underwriter, why their word counts weren't that high for their books, and they knew that they needed to add stuff, but they just weren't exactly sure how. So this is actually a trick that I figured out when I was in high school for writing essays for history class. I know, right? So the question was specifically about how to stop yourself from writing about multiple topics in a paragraph. And when I heard the term topics, I immediately thought about essay writing. Why? That's just how my mind works. And that's what reminded me about this trick I used to use when I was writing essays in high school. A lot of times, the issues, and I realized while I was thinking about that, my issues as an underwriter and my tendency to rush through whatever I was writing originally wasn't just with short stories or novel writing. It was actually a tendency that I just had with writing in general. And I remember when I was in school, I think it was like a history essay that I had to write, and I think the time limit had psyched me out for some reason. So when I would write essays in school, I would get freaked out by the time limit of one class period to write an essay, kind of like how I get freaked out by the time limit of 1 month to write an entire novel for NaNoWriMo. And I would just rush to get the essay done as soon as possible. And so I would write about multiple topics and basically write my entire essay in the introduction paragraph and then be done with it. Now, if this were a paper, I totally could have gone back and edited it, but this was an essay where your first draft is the draft. But we're not here to talk about flaws in the education system. Anyway, so when I would write these essays, I would rush and kind of write everything out on the page as I thought of it, stream of consciousness. My sentences would be coherent, but the overall organization of the essay was all over the place, and I was rushing, so a lot of times I would have multiple topics, like this person said, in one paragraph, sometimes even one sentence, because as I think I've said before, I do have a tendency to have just run-on sentences that I have worked on since then, but it's always something that I look out for. So the way that this person phrased this message unlocked the secret knowledge in my brain and inspired this video, so here I am. So this is the advice that I gave this person, and I thought I'd share it just in case, it helps somebody else who's also an underwriter and has problems with rushing. This is something that I'm also working on as well. I tend to do this when I'm in the revision stage, but once you become aware of it in the revision stage, I find the next book or the next writing project, you get better about it in the drafting stage. So keep this in mind, is when you're writing about multiple topics or things in a paragraph when you're drafting, the easiest fix is honestly to just break it up into a paragraph for each topic so you can give each one proper attention. The great thing about drafting a novel is that you don't have to turn it into anybody. It is not an essay that's due at the end of class time for a test grade, like what I had been freaking out about. This is a trick that I would use in those essays. Then all of a sudden my essays were actually coherent and organized. I would just take the topics that I was tempted to write about and make little bullet points before I started writing, and then I would just check them off as I went along. Now when you're drafting, you can do this in your actual Word document where you don't have to make a bullet point because you're not, handwriting it, presumably. I mean, if you are, you can do that. Anyway, so if that is something that you struggle with, where you have a tendency to just kind of put everything together in mishmash, like you put in your setting and your character descriptions and your emotional beats and everything all together, all smushed together in one paragraph, the easiest fix to stop yourself from writing about multiple topics would be take each of those parts and just separate them out. One paragraph for setting, one paragraph for character descriptions or character development, and then one paragraph for emotional beats. This is gonna feel weird when you do it at first, and you might go in the opposite direction, but this will give you the visual cues of, oh, okay, I need to add more here, because it won't all be mushed together in one paragraph. If you break it up into a paragraph for each topic, you can give each one proper attention because you'll have those visual cues of, okay, this is a separate paragraph, so I have to write enough for a paragraph. You can always combine or edit stuff out later if you decide you don't like it, but it will help you slow down. It will definitely help you slow down. It will definitely help you make sure you actually write out those character descriptions, actually write out those settings, actually flush out those emotional beats. So when you do this, you might end up with the opposite problem where you end up overwriting these parts, ironically, because then you keep having the visual cue of like, oh, I need to write more here, I need to write more here, but you'll end up balancing it out the more you do it, so it'll be fine. The more you do it, the more you'll be able to kind of figure out what the correct balance is. I especially encourage, if you think you have problems with pacing, to get feedback on it, either through beta readers or a critique partner as well. Doesn't really know the story like you know the story, because you know what the pacing is supposed to be. So like when you read through your manuscript, you're gonna kind of superimpose what the pacing should be while you're reading it, or you're gonna go the other way and you're gonna be too critical, and anything that is a teensy bit slow is gonna read too slow, and anything that's a teensy bit fast is gonna read too fast. Or you might just be kind of done with that particular part of your manuscript and you just don't want to look at it anymore. Get a pair of fresh eyes to look at it, so that way you can get some feedback and kind of figure out the balance while you're trying to figure out how to stop yourself from rushing. So that is my tip, and that's always helped me whenever I notice that I'm really starting to rush. I tend to do it in the revisions phase, like when I was revising with my beta readers. In my beta readers feedback video, you can learn more about that whole process of forcing myself to revise because people were reading it and then looking at that feedback and kind of figuring out, okay, so this is what I need to do next time. Another thing I've learned from different types of writing, that because I am just an underwriter in general, another trick I do to kind of get myself to slow down and really explain things, because another issue that underwriters tend to have, they tend to kind of gloss over things, because think about it, when you're writing, you already know what's going to happen in your book as you're writing. Regardless of if you're a discovery writer or an outline writer, whatever you are, you already know what's going to happen next for the most part. Maybe just in the moment or literally the word that you're about to write on the page, but you already know what's going to happen, or you know the backstory. So another thing that underwriters tend to do is they don't always explain things, like with regards to backstory or world building. And so whenever I encounter a moment like that when I'm writing, I do this more when I'm drafting now, but I started doing that when I was in the revisions phase, because I would get feedback from critique partners or beta readers, and they would be like, so what's happening here? And I'd be like, oh yeah, you have no idea because you're not in my mind. So one of the things I started to do was I kind of approach it like an email when I introduce something. When you're introducing a new topic and you're an underwriter, think of it like you're writing an email to someone for the first time. For some reason, when I'm writing an email, it gives the cue to my brain. It's the cue in my brain to kind of explain things as thoroughly as possible, because nothing is more annoying than having to email someone back and forth to explain that, as per my previous email, I already said that. I just think to myself, explain this like you would in an initial email for anything regarding world building, backstory or anything like that. That can always help you kind of slow down. Also, tendencies of an underwriter, you'll kind of write it as it comes up, because that's something that you do when you write an email. I mean, if you write an email to somebody, you're not going to start bringing up stuff out of nowhere, right? That has nothing to do with the original intent of writing an email, right? So that's just a good rule of thumb. Also helpful for overwriters too, because that might help you stop yourself from info dumping as well. So be as thorough as possible when it comes to the context that's related to the part of the story that you're in, like you're writing an email. Another really good tip that I got for underwriters was at a free seminar for Author Accelerator. I will link to their services down below. They're a really interesting service called book coaching. What's really interesting about their services is it's kind of in between what an editor does and what a professor or a teacher does. An editor will go through your book and tell you what you need to work on, right? And a teacher will show you ways to improve your writing. So what a book coach does is kind of like a hybrid of those two. I'm gonna link to them down below because that's how I got access to this free seminar. And the seminar was about figuring out if your manuscript was ready to query or ready to publish. One of the things that they talked about was emotional resonance. And if you have that in your writing, then you're probably ready to move on to the next stages of publishing or getting feedback, etc., etc. One of the issues that I think I have this problem sometimes when I write, it always depends on the characters, because I mean, we all have our favorite characters when we write. Some conversations between two characters have a lot of emotional resonance, and then some characters' conversations just don't, even though they totally could, you just don't put it there. And they called this type of writing where you don't have emotional resonance journalist type of writing, because I mean, that's how journalists are supposed to write, right? They're supposed to tell, don't show. They're supposed to do just the facts, ma'am. They write precise, they're concise. This happened, this happened, this happened. There's not a lot of emotion behind what they're writing, which works for journalism. But when you're writing a novel, or you're writing a short story, or you're writing a screenplay, a musical, a video game, etc., etc., you want people to be emotionally invested in your characters. You don't really want people to necessarily be emotionally invested in trying to get the facts about what's happening in the world today. So a common note of feedback would be to add emotion to your writing. There's dialogue between two characters. Are they moving at all when they're doing the dialogue? Do they have like a specific tone of voice, like a sharpness or sarcasm or snark? Do they have like a southern drawl? So just something to keep in mind. Where can you add extra emotion to your writing? Because another type of underwriter is a journalistic type of underwriter where you're just trying to be concise and you're trying to keep emotion out of it, especially considering what you might be writing, because sometimes you try to just keep emotion out of it because what you're writing about could be just a little too close to home, and that's understandable. So in that case, if it's a little too close to home, draft it as a journalistic writer, get some distance from it, and then you can come back to it and add the emotion. But always try to add emotional resonance and look for points where you can do that. So those are my 3 tips today for underwriters. Break up those multiple topics so that way you have those into different paragraphs, so you have visual cues to slow down and give each of them the full attention they deserve. 2, approach giving world building and backstory context like you're writing an email. Keep it relevant within the context, but make sure that you fully explain how it relates to what's happening, as if somebody's getting an email from you out of the blue. And 2, if you're a journalistic type of writer, try to make sure that you're not just presenting just the facts, ma'am. You're also talking about characters' physicality, and you're also discussing the feelings and emotional resonance. That's all I've got for you today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe. I post new videos on Wednesdays. Happy writing!